This is presentation 1 for Sports for International Development. The topic of the presentation is on aid and development. So during the presentation will highlight some key areas of the historical aspects of aid and development and also the development of aid and development over the years as well. So, what to expect during the presentation? During the presentation, hopefully there will be a better understanding of what aid and development is. Not only this, but hopefully there will be a greater understanding of the historical context of aid and development as well. So this will hopefully provide a better understanding of how aid and development came about and why it came about. Why all of a sudden did nations come together to create aid and development around the world? Not only will it look at the historical context, but it will also look at the contemporary, and also eventually we will look at how aid and development allows a link with sport for development as well. So this will look at what opportunities have provided sport for development to be introduced and how it's been introduced as well. So we look at aid and development. So what is aid and development really? If you look at Wickstead's statement on the slide, development is what happens when human beings group themselves together in order to carry out a common endeavour for their mutual benefit and also to share the benefits of individual learning. So straight away, this can relate to aid and development. Straight away, you look at that statement and it shows that the main area for development and the main concept of development is to share the benefits of individual learning. This massively relates to aid as well, as aid would not happen around the world if people had not come together to use their benefits of individual learning and their mutual benefit as well and common endeavour to create aid for countries who haven't gained that or lack that as well. So, the World Health Organization goes on to say the idea that a partnership should exist between donor and receipt rather than the traditional situation in which the relationship was dominated by the wealth and specialised knowledge of one side. Straight away again, this definitely does link to aid as well. So this relates to the aspect of aid and how is aid produced, because aid isn't produced by countries being powerful over the other country who needs aid by saying we're going to give you money and we're going to take it away. What it is a partnership between the nations. So aid becomes a partnership between the nations and development becomes a partnership between the nations that agree to be together with one nation helping the other one, but gaining a partnership together so there can be a greater help between the two nations. Later on in the presentation, it will also clarify what aid and development is a little bit more as well, and also as well it will help out on when the historical aspect and also the contemporary as well. We now go on to look at the history of aid and development. So during this slide we will look at how aid and development came about, and was this really the first aspect that then generated future aid and development to other nations? So, history of aid and development. The first real known use of aid and development was given after the Second World War. The Second World War was obviously a war that devastated nations across the globe. Nations were left with famine, were left with people looting, were left with no benefits whatsoever and really struggling. So aid had to come in, and who provided that aid? Aid and development was originally used for the first time by the US after the Second World War. This was originally done, and with a lot of conspiracy as well, to act as a support during the Cold War to other nations, suggests Williams. So, for instance, the Cold War was a war between the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union. It wasn't a war where there was violence, it was a war between arms and power. So the main aim of the two nations was to prove that they were powerful, and the aim of the game was to take over as much of the world as possible and provide their points of view. So, as a part of their bid to help other nations, the US set up the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was set up in an attempt to stop and block off Soviet expansion, and also with giving money, and which I'll develop a little bit later in the next slide, with giving money and also resources to other nations, this was an attempt to try and stop the USSR's Soviet expansion plan. So, with the US being the first country to really show aid and development, like I mentioned in the last slide, they produced the Marshall Plan. So what was the Marshall Plan? The Marshall Plan was introduced in 1947 by State Secretary George Marshall. This was in an attempt to provide aid to the Western nations to rebuild spirit and economy in the Western Europe. So the Soviet Union had originally taken over Eastern Europe with their ways, and they were gradually expanding, and President Truman at the time really didn't want an expansion from Russia into the rest of Europe. So as a result of this, he appointed George Marshall as State Secretary in 1947, who then came up with the plan of the Marshall Plan to try and help nations recover from World War II by providing them with money. So how much money was provided? With nations being struck by famine and lack of resources, this is where 16 nations, including Germany, who were the cause of World War II and got the blame for it, became part of the Marshall Plan. And as part of the Marshall Plan, the US provided up to $13 billion US dollars to countries to try and get them back on their feet. This was done to give them food, to give them resources, to give them new buildings, to give them infrastructure, and as a result, hope that they'd be that strong again through the Marshall Plan that they wouldn't need help or aid off any other country. As a result of the Marshall Plan giving money together and nations coming together to be part of the Marshall Plan with the US, it also helped develop and become develop the United Nations to form. The United Nations is still an organisation now which comes together to discuss problems and to discuss aid and to discuss the development of other nations around the world when needed. This still sets today, so it just shows all the way from 1947 onwards that the Marshall Plan really set up a good solid infrastructure for worldwide development as well. Attached to this presentation PowerPoint on this slide is a YouTube video. This YouTube video shows a little bit more depth of how the Marshall Plan worked and how it helped other nations and why it was developed as well. So with the Marshall Plan coming to an end in 1951 and the Cold War as well coming to an end, there was a little bit of time where aid and development wasn't really concentrated on and wasn't looked at as much as to a greater extent because America weren't funding it as much anymore, and there was a little bit of nations trying to get back to how they were and a concentration on that more than anything. However, in 1984 there was a real struggle in Ethiopia with famine and starvation. This was causing deaths on deaths on deaths, and as a result of this, NGOs were formed. NGOs are a non-profit organisation which can be shown through a local, national or international level. Their relationship with the United Nations differs depending on their goals according to the NGO website. So with the NGOs forming, they formed to create an alliance to try and help other nations get back on their feet and to try and work with the United Nations to help their aims to help countries develop themselves. So this instantly relates to development, as it's a non-profit organisation working with another non-real profit organisation with the United Nations to develop other countries out of famine, out of out of the ruins and try and get them back on their feet, very similar to what the Marshall Plan did. So as a result of this, as Ethiopia was struggling in 1984, Bob Geldof, a worldwide known singer with many hits, created the Feed the World campaign. The Feed the World campaign was created in an attempt to generate money and to create money to provide money for Ethiopia to get back, or try and get them back, to limit famine. Attached to this presentation, attached to this slide, is a little interview with Bob Geldof, who goes on to say the reason why he created this Feed the World campaign and the reasons why it affected him so much. One of the main reasons he does go on to talk about is the fact that no person should deal with the effects that Ethiopia has to go through and the sights he saw. As a result of creating the Feed the World campaign, it allowed Bob Geldof to produce the hit single Feed the World, which has had many attempts, the last one coming in 2017, which has just been. Also as well, it allowed him to also go on to do concerts in Los Angeles and also Florida and also London as well. This was an attempt to bring in more money for the NGO of Feed the World. And as a result, he did, and managed to help Ethiopia in some aspects stop famine. Not as much as people would have hoped so, but still try to. Also, as a result of Bob Geldof's Feed the World campaign, it also allowed other people to realise there needs to be more NGOs in the world, which also allowed a route for development through that aspect as well. As previously mentioned, as the Feed the World campaign made such an impact in Ethiopia around the world, and it says everything today when the song's still being reproduced, it enabled more NGOs to form, and this effectively provided more aid for around the world and also development for other countries. As a result of more NGOs being formed around the 80s, it also showed, as you can see from the stats on the presentation now, it also allowed a greater rise from 10 to 20% between the 70s and 90s of aid across the globe. So before Bob Geldof's single in 1984, there was only around 10% of aid across the world. So all of a sudden now, Bob Geldof produced his song Feed the World and created an NGO in 1984. This effectively allowed greater increase on percentages from 10 to 20 and 25% for aid across the globe. So instantly it shows that Bob Geldof's impact of the Feed the World campaign, and to really show nations around the world that there is problems around the globe and there is people in less fortunate circumstances as them. It allowed nations to sit up and allow people to sit up and realise something needs to be done. And as a result of that, more NGOs were created, and between the 70s and the 90s, there was an increase of 10% of aid across the globe. Not only this, but in the 70s as well, the UN decided to change strategy. So the original strategy of the UN, the United Nations, was to focus on a large infrastructure, meaning to concentrate on larger, greater aspects and aims, which didn't allow them to focus on things certain things in general. So they would be focusing on greater projects, but not focusing on nations who really needed the aid and needed the basics of education, the clean water, the rural roads. So as a result of the UN not being as successful in the 70s, there was a change of strategy. The strategy, as Coulter suggests, came from the UN to decide that instead of doing larger infrastructure, like I just said, that they needed to introduce specific aims and strategies to certain nations, which introduced basic education, clean water and rural roads. As a result of that, hopefully it showed the UN that there was more aid that should be developed within nations. And again, looking at that stat between the 70s and 90s, does the UN strategy change, all of a sudden help aid across the globe rise as well. So, having highlighted the historical context on where aid and development came along through the Marshall Plan, it is clear to understand that aid and development has been a progression over the years. So with the Marshall Plan providing aid to start off with, and then also the UN forming and having their aims in the 70s, and also then with Bob Geldof's Feed the World, it does show that there's been an increase in aid and development over the years, and also with the contemporary perspective on it as well, that there is a gradual increase. With the increase of NGOs and aid across the globe, it also allows more opportunities for NGOs to involve different aspects, so not just providing clean water, clean food, infrastructure on buildings, etc. It also allows more NGOs now, as there's been a greater increase, to look at sport for development of countries. So within the next couple of slides, the slides will be focused on how sport is now introduced and how it's been introduced into NGOs and introduced to aid and development to provide benefits for countries who are struggling. So as mentioned in the previous slide, sports for development has become more and more reliable for aid and development of other nations. So sports for development has become a route and has become rooted for over time and time. So we look back to the Marshall Plan where it originally started for aid and development of other countries, and then we look at the previous slide, and as mentioned through Bob Geldof's Feed the World, there's more and more aid being produced across the world now. Also, with aid being produced across the world, it allows a greater increase and continual rise of NGOs as well. With the NGOs rising, it allows a more diverse organisations to come about, which then means instead of NGOs just concentrating on increasing wealth within nations, trying to reduce famine, it also allows NGOs now to concentrate on other aspects and trying to develop nations in other ways. And one of the ways that this could be done is through sport. So sports for development has come about through the increase of NGOs. So with organisations like ISA and UNICEF, it allows a greater opportunity for sport to help in aid development as well. So there's one company, the company ISA in particular, looks to get young vulnerable children away from poverty and violence by introducing sport. So again, like mentioned on the slide, ISA also looks to keep families in deprived nations a minority. So you look at this and it looks to, the NGO looks to provide sport for people in poverty-stricken areas to get out of potential violence and potential worrying situations for them. So as you may know, there's nations around the world where there's trafficking, there's murders, there's violence, there's gang crime, there's drugs. Sports development and NGO organisations allows and gives that opportunity for young vulnerable children or even adults to get away from that situation, to get away from putting families at risk, to get away from putting themselves at risk, and to get away from potentially ruining the nation even further by doing such careless acts. So sport for development can help nations gain better understanding and gain another option for people instead of being forced into the violent criminal ways of that country might be known for. So also as well as providing an opportunity to get out to gang related and potential violence and potential threatening situations for nations, the NGOs that do participate, that do provide sports for development, such as ISA, it also allows them the chance to prove themselves. So it also allows them to participate in opportunities which they might have never been offered before. which then effectively could allow them to produce or to create a future career for them within that, which could allow greater money as well for themselves. Not only this, but the NGOs as well aren't just producing sport for nations, they're also using sport as an example to demonstrate the importance of aid and development as well. For example, we look at Barcelona a couple of years ago when they had UNICEF as a sponsor on the kit. This shows now that NGOs are becoming that important and aid and development is becoming that important around the world that one of the world's biggest football clubs is willing to let them sponsor them for free. This shows the development already of aid across the world and the importance and the recognition for it by letting a charity and an NGO like UNICEF produce their sponsor on a football kit such as Barcelona. So in general, sports for development is a gradual increase within aid and development as well. So to conclude, it allows sport to produce different opportunities, and also it allows it to show the world how important aid and development is for nations across the globe. To conclude the presentation, we looked firstly at the historical aspects of aid and development. So the main thing we looked at was the Marshall Plan, and the first real use of aid was produced by the Marshall Plan by the US. It allowed us to gain an understanding that the Marshall Plan was used to enable countries to regain strength and support, which also the slides provided an understanding of why they did that. So it provided an understanding, the presentation has provided an understanding of why the Marshall Plan was produced. For example, to stop Soviet expansion, to gain the respect of other nations, which then formed the UN as a result of it. Also, with the Cold War ending, it allowed the Feed the World campaign to proceed. As noted in the presentation, with the Feed the World campaign proceeding, it allowed a greater rise in aid across the world from 10% to 20%, which shows the impact of the first real NGO campaign straight away from what it was from 10% before the 70s towards the 90s. Also as well, we looked at how the development of NGOs allowed an introduction for sport for development, and how sport development has now been introduced within aid and development, and hopefully in future presentations there will be a greater understanding now of what sports for development does and how it affects other nations as well.